This past year, the Commonwealth Institute partnered with the Community Foundation and helped us build the Opportunity Index, providing all of the data for it that Michael will now present. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming this morning, and please join me in welcoming to the Shape of the Region Conference, Michael Cassidy.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you so much to the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia and the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce, and to all the sponsors for creating this opportunity to discuss not only the shape of the region today, but how we can work together to shape the region for the future. And thank you all for coming out this morning, because it's only through broad collaboration that we can understand the concerns and hopes of all parts of our community. So I want to thank Kevin for that lovely introduction. The Commonwealth Institute was partner with the Community Foundation in developing the Opportunity Index. We provide independent analysis on state fiscal and economic policies with a particular focus on how they affect middle-class and low-income Virginians. And it was a wonderful collaboration to bring to bear our data analytical skills with the Community Foundation's profound interest and connections throughout the community of Northern Virginia to develop this exciting new tool, the Opportunity Index. So I've been asked to give you all a glimpse of the Opportunity Index and to lift up some of the key findings in it to date, to sort of spark some interest and ideas around how valuable this new tool can be for our community conversations. So first of all, the index is an easy-to-use resource that looks across Northern Virginia at overall trends in our region's economy, community health, civic life, and educational opportunities. But it also looks within the region at the differences between and among this region's cities and counties, as well as between and among different age groups, different races and ethnicities, and different immigration statuses. This map shows you how Northern Virginia is defined for the foundation and for this project. So it includes the inner ring areas of Arlington and Alexandria, Falls Church, and Fairfax, as well as areas outside of the Beltway like Loudoun, Prince William, Fairfax City, Manassas, and Manassas Park. So all of the data in the Opportunity Index is of and related to this definition of the Northern Virginia region. So let's look at some of the general demographics. This is a view of what the Opportunity Index looks like when you were if you were to look at it online. And I'm sure that you can't read everything on this slide, but let me just say that as a user, you can choose the topic area along that top bar and then select individual localities or the region as a whole, different demographics, the indicator you want to examine, and the date range that you want to look at. So here we'll first take a look at some of the general demographics in the region, which sounds a little boring, but trust me, it's going to come with some surprises. So now we're going to do a little quiz. We're going to put Matthew's clickers into action this morning and see whose second cup of coffee has kicked in. So let's have a couple questions to see what you all already know about our region. So this is your first chance to use those clickers, and I want to ask you all, what's the percentage of children in Northern Virginia living with at least one immigrant parent? What's the percentage of children in Northern Virginia living with at least one immigrant parent? So use your clickers. Is it number 1, 0 to 15%, 2, 15 to 35%, 3, 30 to 45%, or 4, 45 to 60%? What's the percentage of children in Northern Virginia living with at least one immigrant parent? Okay. I'm sorry, the glare is 50% say 30 to 45%. Close. But when you look at the data, you see that actually 47% of the children in Northern Virginia now live in households with at least one foreign-born parent. Now, what's fascinating about that data point is that it has grown by 20% in the last 5 years. And that same percentage for Virginia as a whole is just 23%. And for the nation as a whole, it's just 26%. Okay, so we have markedly higher percentage of the children in this community living in families with at least one immigrant parent than the rest of the state or the nation as a whole. Pretty stunning when you think about the implications of that, both in terms of our region's needs, opportunity, and profound diversity. Okay, here's another chance to test our knowledge. When do we think Northern Virginia will transition to a minority-majority population? Now, as we all know, racial categories have evolved over time in this country and are quite contentious today. But if the current generally accepted categories hold, including the inclusion of Hispanic and Latino folks of all races as people of color, Northern Virginia, as well as the country as a whole, are becoming less and less white. When do you think Northern Virginia will transition into a majority-minority population? For this one, you should know that 2015 is the most recent year of data that we have for this indicator. So first, do you think it's already happened? Second, do you think it'll be between 2015 and 2020? Third, between 2020 and 2025? Or fourth, between 2025 and 2030? Let's check in and see where our results are. Okay, so we have healthy percentages thinking it's already happened or it's going to happen between 2015 and 2020. So we might not be able to reach this, but currently almost 47% of the residents of Northern Virginia are people of color, which is up from 43% 5 years ago. And if current trends continue, I would guess that the region will be majority people of color by 2020. So we are a quickly diversifying community here. By contrast, just to sort of put this in even broader perspective, in 1980, 85% of the people in this region identified as non-Hispanic white. So that's really quite stunning when we think about the kind of transformation we have demographically going on in our region, especially when you just think back to as recently as 1980, which some of us in this room are old enough to remember that. Okay, now let's take a look beyond some of these general demographic questions and look at the economy, because the Opportunity Index covers more areas than just general demographic trends. So let's look at some of the economic measures that we have within the Opportunity Index. So you can see, you can select down in the Opportunity Index for a whole array of them. I'd like to start by looking at regional unemployment rates. This is an example of a graph showing all of the cities and counties in Northern Virginia, as well as the region as a whole. So this is a very, very busy graph, and I just want to assure you that when using the Opportunity Index online, you can click on the legend to turn off or on any particular lines that you don't want to see. So you can sort of hone in on the things that you want to look at. Northern Virginia as a whole is that light orange line, and as you'd expect, the unemployment rate for the region peaked in the period of 2009 to 2013 and has been on the decline ever since. But I think the more interesting story here are some of the consistent differences across localities in terms of this key measure, with very low unemployment rates consistently in Loudoun County and Arlington, and much higher rates in Prince William and Manassas. Let's look at another measure of economic health, which is household income. And of course, differences don't just exist across cities and counties, they also exist within communities. Economic barriers, both past and present, create stark and persistent differences in household income in Northern Virginia by race. The median household income headed by non-Hispanic white folks and Asian American folks is about $100,000 a year, compared to $78,000 for black-headed households and $67,000 for Hispanic or Latino-headed households. I think it's also interesting to note that although black and African American headed households have seen modest gains in this measure over the last 6 years, Hispanic headed households have seen losses in median income in recent years here in Northern Virginia. So the Opportunity Index allows us to look at some of those key trends among different racial groups. Next, let's turn to education. A key driver of the region's success is obviously the highly educated community and workforce that we have here. But it's also a place where we see some disparity by race and immigration status. Let's check in with looking at some of these education measures to see what some of the key trends are that are of particular interest. First, let's look at high school graduates and dropouts. These charts show you the sheer number of high school dropouts and graduates in our region by race using data from the Department of Education. Overall, on-time graduation rates have increased in the region, driven mostly by substantial gains among Black and Hispanic students. However, barriers remain, and as of 2016, only 81% of Hispanic students graduated on time in the region, compared to 93% of Black students and nearly 100% of white and Asian American students. Let's check in on another aspect of education: career and technical education. This, of course, prepares students with marketable skills in areas like information technology, manufacturing, health sciences, that can all be used for immediate employment or gain entry to career and technical colleges. Again, using the Department of Education data, we tallied up certifications by field and by locality. Here you can see it by city and county within Northern Virginia. And interestingly, there's an increase in certifications earned in Prince William County and Loudoun County, and some decrease in Fairfax County. But of course, with such a large school division, Fairfax remains the overall leader in certifications earned. And especially when we think about the conversation we'll be having later this morning about workforce development issues, looking at where we have these credentials and career and technical education, preparing students for those, is, I think, a key data point to check in on. Okay, so let's look at some other measures within the index that would be of interest. One key area is what we call community health and civic life. This is, of course, a very important measure when we think about the quality of life here in the region. You know, whether you can get home on time for dinner or to tuck your kids in at night, whether young people are on a path to success or are disconnected from school or work, whether you're worried about a medical bill that could bankrupt you and your family. So let's take a look inside some of these indicators in this critical category for understanding the health and opportunity within our region. First, let's look at health insurance. As we know, health insurance coverage is one of the key policy issues of our time. And Virginia, as well as the rest of the country, has seen sharp drops in the number of uninsured residents after many years of increases. But some of our most important health insurance programs have barriers for large components of the population here in Northern Virginia. For example, there are significant barriers for legal immigrants with green cards here in Virginia. And as a result, foreign-born residents in Northern Virginia are 5 times as likely to be uninsured as US-born residents in the region. So there are almost 170,000 immigrants living in Northern Virginia who lack health insurance coverage. let's look at disconnected youth. Because for all that is strong and thriving in our region and our community, there are some very continuing, troubling disparities for the next generation that I think are important for us to look at and wrap our hands around as we think about how we address the challenges and opportunities of the future. The older teen and young adult years are a critical time for young people that can really have lasting impact and consequences for their whole lives. But almost 10% of all residents of Northern Virginia between the ages of 16 and 24 are neither in school nor working. Despite progress on these fronts in recent years, that's the same rate as back in 1980. So that is, I think, a persistent challenge that we face as a region, and some of this data helps us hone in on just how challenging it is to crack that nut and make serious strides in that area. But that 10% number is even higher for certain groups. Around 14% of Black youth in Northern Virginia are disconnected from both school and jobs, which is much higher than the regional average for non-Hispanic white youth or for Asian American youth in the region. These young people are too often overlooked, which makes, I think, the work of businesses and nonprofits like those who are gathered here today, who are supported by the foundation in so many of their initiatives and their projects, all that much more critical in terms of thinking about effective strategies to connect these youth to jobs and opportunities, because we clearly have some challenging trends in this critical area. So this is just a glimpse of some of the information that is available in the Opportunity Index. I do encourage you to read the newly released report that is in your packets on the Opportunity Index. It is a beautiful report. The foundation and their team and our staff partnered with a very creative graphic designer to pull together a lot of this rich and compelling data in a way that I think is accessible and easy to read and can be something that we can all turn to and look back to as we draw from it to spark additional conversations. The Opportunity Index is also online, so please do go online and explore it yourself. I have just hit on a few of the key highlights of some of the interesting trends that we wanted to lift up this morning to spark some conversation and to show some of the possibilities of insight you can gain from using the Opportunity Index. But there is plenty more there, regardless of what your particular area of interest in or what kind of sector your focus is. I am sure you will find something in the Opportunity Index to inform and grow your awareness and understanding of these things. And I think that it's really by arming community members like yourselves, community leaders, and stakeholders with this information that the true needs of our region can be understood better, and we hope can help us all shape a future in our community that is both stronger and more equitable, with real opportunity for all. Thank you very much.
If it wasn't obvious from the introduction, it's probably obvious to you by now that I'm not from Northern Virginia. There's actually a joke about Virginia, which I'm going to waste a minute of my time to tell you, but when the US Embassy was being moved within London, one of their suggested sites was in a part of London that was actually owned by one of our most distinguished lords. And so the US reached out to this lord and said, we'd actually like to move our embassy, but we need to use a bit of your land to do it. And he said, well, that's no problem. I'm sure we can do some sort of deal. And they said, what sort of deal? And he said, well, actually, my family lost some land in your country a while ago. So if you'd consider giving me that land back, then I'd consider giving you this land in London. And they said, well, sure, we'll look into that. Where is the land? He said, I think you call it Virginia. Needless to say, the embassy went somewhere else. But So actually, and it's a reminder of heterogeneity in data, because I would be one of the families listed as having at least one immigrant parent. So just even within those categories, there's of course a huge amount of variation. I'm also very grateful to Kevin for mentioning the Politico top 50 list. I must say that in previous years, I've always thought that list of top thinkers was absolutely ridiculous, totally subjective, no bearing on reality, clearly just clickbait nonsense. But this year, proud to be on it. And it's both an advantage and a disadvantage to be having this conversation as someone who comes from the UK, because the disadvantage, of course, is I'm still learning a lot about US inequality and US class. The advantage is I come from a country that knows a lot about class and class inequality. And actually, as of 2016, I'm a US citizen. I became a US citizen. I live in Maryland, just over the road. Thank you. And the US is the only country in the world where people applaud you for becoming a citizen. In the UK, it'd be like, eh? And actually, I became a citizen on the very last day that you had to do so in my state in Maryland in order to be eligible to vote. So in 2016, I was able to vote in the presidential election, and by mail-in, I was able to vote in the Brexit EU referendum. I am not a political person, so I'm not going to make any political points about either of those results. But I will say that a French friend of mine texted me and said, for God's sake, don't take French citizenship. Which I didn't, and Macron won. So there you go. Could be a correlation. So I'm just going to go through this. That picture of me is from about 15 years ago. It's brilliant. I'm just going to go through. I'm going to tell a story which led me to write a book and to do the work that I've done at Brookings. But to sort of cut straight to the chase, one of my findings from my work at Brookings compared to my work in the UK is that the US has a class system that operates every bit as ruthlessly and efficiently as the class system in the UK. Arguably more so. It does so differently, but the class system in the US is every bit as sticky as the UK. But in the US, it does so under something of a kind of veneer of classlessness, and the idea of meritocracy, only in America, Horatio Alger, etc. And that's a very attractive vision for a nation. It's one of the reasons I'm here and wanted my two sons to finish their education in the US, because of that idea of a classless society. And I think there are two main reasons why class as a form of inequality is not discussed much in the US, one good, one bad. The good reason is because of the continued salience of racial inequality and the long history of racial injustice, and I don't obviously need to talk about that in this room. That's a good reason why class hasn't been so salient, but I think the bad reason is because there is this sort of idea that we live in a classless society, and that's most appealing, of course, to the winners. That's most appealing, of course, to those who are at the top of that society, to convince themselves that it's classless. The danger with that is it means that the people at the top can convince themselves that they're entitled to everything that they get, because after all, they got there in a classless society. Or as I put it in my book, rather bluntly, at least in the UK, the posh people have the decency to feel guilty some of the time. I never thought I'd see that as a good thing, but there is something to be said for the sense of at least being aware that perhaps your current position of economic power and relative privilege isn't only the result of your own brilliance and diligence, and maybe the result of some other factors too. And I think that that cuts across issues of race, gender, and class. So I'm just going to go through a story. So I tell a story about this man. Don't worry, this is not going to be a political talk at all. But I want to tell the story of how I kind of arrived at my conclusion. This was in 2015, and there are some younger people in the audience, so just in case, this is Barack Obama, 44th President of the United States. Actually, it's actually been such an interesting time politically that it feels like quite a long time ago, although it's really not. I'm going to tell a story about him, which is a tax reform. We just had a big tax reform. He proposed a tax reform in 2015, and the failure of that tax reform was quite revealing to me. So I'm going to tell the story. I'm going to do it, as they say in Hollywood, based on true events. based on real events. So he's flying on Air Force One. He's flying on Air Force One from India to Saudi Arabia. With him on Air Force One is Nancy Pelosi, the congresswoman from California. She receives a phone call. She receives a phone call from this man, Chris Van Hollen. Chris Van Hollen, my congressman at the time, now junior senator for Maryland, fine politicians both. And Chris says, Nancy, you've got to talk to the president about this tax change, which had been blowing up in the media. You've got to get him to change his mind about this. She says, well, I'm with him on Air Force One. I'll just wander down the corridor of Air Force One, have a chat with the president. The president's in his office and knock at the door. Hello, who is it? Come in. Oh, hi, it's Nancy. Hi, Nancy. Again, I'm having to sort of speculate a little bit about the conversation, but hi, Nancy, come in. What is it? She said, this tax change. You've got to get rid of it. He says, I'll consult with my senior advisors and get back to you. Goes back into his office, calls the White House, says, hello, White House, it's the president. I don't know how these things work here. You've got to change this tax bill. The very next day, because I'm not going to play the video, the plan was abandoned. And the plan was to reform 529 college savings plans. Hands up who knows what a 529 college savings plan is. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's a large number. I could have done the voting thing and then compared it to how many US citizens know what they are. They are they're actually from President Bush's time in office, the second Bush, which they essentially give you those you know, but they allow you to save into your 529 account, and it's capital gains tax free as long as it's spent on educational spending. And the plan was to retrospectively not do that anymore and to replace it with a tax credit, which would be much more progressive in its impact. And the reason they decided to do that was because of the distributional consequences of the 529 plan. So this chart just shows you on the left-hand axis how many people in each of those income groups, from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. So we've just split the population up from poorest to richest. And then of those who have a 529 account, what's the average balance in that account, which is the right-hand bar and the right-hand axis. And so, look, in a sense, there's nothing surprising about this. There's no point really using the vehicle for capital gains tax relief if you're not going to have any capital gain. And also, it's very hard for people on lower incomes to save into those accounts anyway. Interestingly, the new tax bill expands 529 so that you can use it for private K-12 education as well, which I think will have very significant impact fiscally and educationally. So this was the reason why President Obama said, look, this is not a great use of our money. We're spending $2 billion a year on this. That's nothing in some ways, but we can spend it more effectively. But the world blew up. There was a massive row. The media went crazy, and Pelosi and Van Hollen were among the Liberal Democrats saying, okay, this needs to go. So this is not a party political point at all. But just for interest, these are the median incomes. This is similar to the median income that Michael just showed in the counties that are represented by the two politicians I just mentioned. And they represent very affluent districts, including where I live, compared to the average. So these 529 accounts were used by and known about by predominantly affluent people. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we saw was a huge reaction from the upper middle class. And this is just a quote from Paul Waldman in the kind of post. This is a group that you really don't want to mess with. And it came to me to see that actually we're thinking about inequality in the wrong way here. There's been this sort of Occupy Wall Street 1% way of thinking about inequality, which is just about economics, and it's just about the top 1%. And I think that's an inadequate way to think about it. And what I really kind of thought was, okay, the American upper middle class do know how to look after themselves. And that led me to dig deeper into the sources of inequality and to write my book, which, by the way, is now available as an audiobook. I read it myself, but I had to pass the audition. Given that it's actually quite personal, it was a bit weird that I had to audition for it. But anyway, you can now listen to it if you don't want to read it. Which is making a series of arguments. And I'm not going to be able to get all these. I've realized I have a 40-minute presentation to try and get into the next 15 minutes. So I'll be skipping a little bit. But just so that you get the sense of my overall argument, this is my argument about inequality, which is that the upper middle class, broadly the top 20%, are separating from the majority, that's being passed on generation to generation. There's a big difference between relative and absolute mobility, which I'll explain in a moment. I'm going to skip the case for downward mobility, because it's very unpopular and not my main point here today anyway, but let's be clear, no one's in favour of downward mobility for themselves or their children, and that would be unnatural, but relatively speaking we do need both. I'm going to talk about the problems of market meritocracy in the light of the education system in the US, and then briefly outline opportunity hoarding and finish this issue, which is that I think there's a problem which none of us think we're rich. It's always the person richer than us who's rich, and that's a profound problem in political culture. So that's the sort of structure of it, just in case I don't manage to touch on all that. And as I apologize in advance, I'll skip a few things. But let's start with this argument about separating from everybody else. This is an income inequality story, right? It's not as if income inequality is not something people aren't thinking about. It's a very big political issue in the US right now. One of the problems with it is, I think that the debate about inequality very often doesn't involve enough stakeholders. It particularly doesn't involve businesses enough. In fact, if anything, businesses are quite often seen as kind of the problem in terms of income inequality, rather than, as I tend to think of businesses as hugely being part of the solution. Because inequality is not just a government issue, it's an issue about how we run our businesses, it's about how our communities and so on. And I will say, on a side note, how exciting it is to be at a conference where you don't see this stark separation between the scholars, philanthropists, community organizations on one side and the businesses on the other. If you can't make change happen with the group of people you've got in this room, then you can't make change happen. Because businesses have a hugely important role to play. Not everyone's going to agree about everything all the time. That would be boring. But I do think that actually having a conversation about inequality and opportunity that does not contain businesses is one that is always bound to fail. So I'd like to thank the Chamber of Commerce for being here and sponsoring this event, and all the business people who are in the audience today. So let's just talk a bit about this inequality thing. You've probably heard the "we are the 99%, top 1% thing. I think that's wrong as a way of framing inequality. But to be fair, here's a chart that makes that case. Now, this is a chart showing you from 1979 what's happening to the income of these different groups in the income distribution up until, this is 2011 because I'm using CBO numbers. And this is dollars income in real terms on the left-hand side. The top line is what's happened to the top 1%. The line below that is what's happened to the 19% below them. The line below that, the 40% below them. The line below that, the 40% below them. And so the top 1% are people who've got household incomes north of $400,000 a year. That's people right at the top of the income distribution. The 19% below them have an average income of about $200,000 a year, household income. And to get into that group, you need about $135,000 a year. So healthy six-figure incomes in the line below, and then everybody else in the lines below. Now you look at this and say, well, we are the 99%. Look at us. Those of us who are in that 19%, but not in that top 1%, can easily convince ourselves that we're all in this together. It's just those people at the top. All right? Let's go to Wall Street and have an Occupy Wall Street banner. So it turns out a third of the people on the May Day Occupy demonstration had earnings of more than $100,000. Earnings, individual earnings. That's putting them way up there. That's top 10% of the earnings distribution, and yet they were carrying banners assailing inequality. So let's just be careful here, though, because as Michael knows for sure, and many of you know too, social scientists, researchers do their dirty work in a number of places. We do it in our footnotes. We also do it in our left-hand axis. In order to show what's happening to the top 1%, look how far I've had to stretch the left-hand axis in terms of income. It's starting up to 2 million. That has the effect of flattening all of the lines below. All right? One of the things I always teach my students, I teach part-time, is I can show you a chart that proves anything about inequality just by changing the parameters. So that's what I'm going to do, change the parameters. I'm going to take out the top 1% altogether. This chart doesn't contain the top 1%. It contains the 19% below them, the 40% below them, and the 40% below them. So that line is not being pulled up artificially by the top 1%. It's not as exciting a chart, is it? I mean, it's really hard to get people to march. Yeah, I'm out there. Yeah, this is like, yeah, it's a trend, but no one's getting banners out, are they? But I actually think it's a much more important divide. Because what this is telling me is that there has been no increase in income inequality in the bottom 80% of the US income distribution, nor, by the way, has there been very much income growth in the bottom 80% of the income distribution. 5 minutes left. Wow, I'm really mistiming this. But it is telling me that 19% below the top 1% are pulling away. So that's the group I define as the upper middle class. And I think this is a kind of inequality that we don't think enough about. And these are people who, by and large, have four-year college degrees. Marriage rates are very high among this group. They're tending to marry other college graduates. There's a higher wage premium on four-year college degrees, and they're pulling away. They're also separating not only in terms of those issues, but economic, but in terms of family structure. As I mentioned, their health, wealth, life expectancy gaps are growing At the bottom, they're now dropping in the US. The average rate, life expectancy has just dropped in the US, but that's because it's being pulled down by the bottom. It's not people like us. Our life expectancy is still growing. So there's growing inequality, all of these things, etc. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a few things. So I'm just going to show you some charts which would take me 5 minutes to explain. So I'm just going to tell you what they say, and you're going to have to trust me. Poor people stay poor, rich people stay rich, wealthy people stay wealthy. There you go. There's a big difference between relative and absolute mobility. Relative mobility is when we move up and down the ladder, and that's necessarily a zero-sum game. I can only have 20% of the population in the top 20%. But absolute mobility is, are you better off than your parents? And there are two different kinds of mobility. This is absolute mobility. What percentage of Americans are better off than their parents were at the same age based on the year they were born? 90% of the Americans born in 1940 surpassed their parents' income. 50% of the Americans born in 1980 have surpassed their parents' income. Now, of course, the US economy is growing by 4% a year for 25 years in the post-war years. You have a fast-growing economy, then, yeah, people get better off. But it's not just that. This is work from Raj Chetty and his team, which shows that actually what this chart shows you, and again, it'll take a while to explain, is that, like, what's happening? Why is this drop in absolute mobility? There are two things that could be happening. One, lower growth. Two, more income inequality. In other words, the growth isn't being spread around as much. What this chart shows you is more about inequality. Roughly 2/3 of this drop is explained by rising income inequality as opposed to lower growth. But the thing is that when there's high growth, when you've got a prosperous economy, businesses doing well, actually, if someone overtakes you on a highway that's moving along, you don't mind. So even if you lose a little bit of relative position, right? Someone's getting it a little bit faster than you, but you're all getting there. Well, no stress, right? Or little stress. If you mind someone overtaking you when you're all going 60 miles an hour, then you have deeper psychological problems, and I can deal with it. Wow, 2 minutes. Okay, I can do it. But imagine a world in which actually growth is really low. Productivity growth is low. The economy is just sluggish. Then someone overtaking you feels a bit more like this. Anyone who travels on the Beltway will recognize this picture? Which is, someone cuts in. You really get angry. And so what happens is that when we have lower growth and we don't have businesses growing and employment growing, then relative status becomes more important. We get angrier if we perceive someone is getting ahead of us. And so relative mobility actually becomes harder when we've got lower growth and lower absolute mobility. All right, I'm going to skip all this. This is about my stuff in the Times. And I'm going to skip the case for downward mobility because nobody wants downward mobility, do they? And I am going to do this. I'm going to talk about education, because we've heard quite a bit about education already, and I know we're going to hear more about it in the panel in a moment. And the fact that you have Scott Rawls from the Northern Virginia Community College in your audience is very exciting to me, because as you'll see in a moment, community colleges are hugely important, and to have a well-functioning community college system is one of the most precious things that any region or city can have. And the one that you have under Scott's leadership has a national reputation for its ingenuity and its progressive approach to educating many of your students. So thank you for your work, Scott. So some dates, a reminder that the idea of meritocracy was born as a dystopia. Michael Young wrote this book 60 years ago this year as a warning as to what would happen in a society that came to believe itself to be a meritocracy. 4 things would happen. Inequality would rise because the winners are convinced they deserve their winnings. After all, it's a meritocracy. So don't come after my tax breaks. Don't come after my access to schools, etc. Stop. Okay. The second thing that happens is everyone becomes obsessed with who they marry and who they have children with, because you want to have smart children. And so you engage in what sociologists call assortative mating, marrying people with similar levels of education as yourself. It's not a very romantic term. Don't use it in your online dating profile. But it's happening. The third thing that happens is that those who are not doing so well, remember my chart with the bottom 80%, who are not doing so well grow increasingly angry and disengaged and despairing, because it is really hard to not succeed in a society that keeps telling you that it's a meritocracy. After all, you've only yourself to blame. So you see rising disenchantment and disengagement and disconnection from the losers in the meritocracy. And the last thing that happens in Young's book, there is a violent revolution that overthrows the meritocratic rulers. It's worth a read, this book. So I know I'm running a little bit over. I've actually built in some time for questions. So I'm just going to use a little bit of my question time. And maybe I'll just use all of it so that you can't ask me anything. This is one of the most striking charts that has been produced in recent social science. This is based on Raj Chetty's work using the tax data for every single US citizen. It's anonymized, don't worry. And what it does is it shows you, are you in college between the ages of 18 to 21, percentage on the left-hand axis, based on how rich or poor your parents were, from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. This shows me the correlation between how much money your parents have and what chance you have of being enrolled in college between the ages of 18 to 21. Each of those dots is a percentile on the distribution. The red line is the average line through it. You don't need the red line in this case. This is one of the highest correlations that has been found in the social science literature. To know with this degree of precision, based on your parents' income alone, whether you're enrolled in college between 18 to 21, this is literally one of the most beautiful and terrifying charts I have ever seen. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, said that the mark of a civilized person is the ability to look at a column of numbers and weep. If I can change that to chart, I would say the same thing. Now, of course, that doesn't tell me where they go to college. And here we're getting into which kinds of college. This is now of those who go to college. And of course, I missed out the mature students from that chart before. Where do they go? Well, bottom 40, middle 40, top 20. Top 20% of people, upper middle class, they are going to four-year colleges and by and large, four-year selective colleges. That is the rite of passage for an upper middle class American kid now. Where does everyone else go? Well, you can see, two-year institutions. Look how many of the kids from the bottom 80% are being served by two-year institutions, at least initially. They may then transfer, and then into four-year publics and so on. So if you want to see the US class system, if you want to see it, look at our post-secondary institutions. That is where the class system becomes visible. And then just for fun, you can see, this is from Raj Chetty's work again, what percentage of students at these different institutions are from those different income quintiles. Poorest quintile on the left to the richest on the right, and they've thrown in the top 1% at Harvard just for fun. What this shows you is that there is this dramatic class gradient in the kinds of institutions that people attend. And what that means is, first of all, we should be doing more to open up access to four-year institutions and so on to poorer kids and so on. But it also means that as things stand, if you want to invest in opportunity and you want to invest in the bottom 80%, bottom 40 or 80%, then forget about the selective four-year colleges almost and focus on the institutions that those kids are actually attending and invest in them and make them better and stronger. So that's why I made the point about Northern Virginia Community College. Now, I am out of time. So I'm just going to conclude then with none of this stuff, because this is all just about housing. So I'll tell you what they say. Housing's getting really expensive because we're over-regulating the housing market. Legacy admissions, where you have a hereditary principle in college admissions, is outrageous and should go away. And internships are getting more important, but internships are allocated unfairly. That was the short version. This is a chart that's difficult actually to interpret even on a good day, especially when I'm rushing. But what it essentially shows you is that when you ask people what kind of income you need to be rich, it's always essentially people who are richer than me. So people who are on $30,000 a year think $100,000 makes you rich. People who are on $100,000 a year think you need $500,000 a year to be rich. So the top 20% Americans we have convinced ourselves that we're not rich. No, it's just that top 1%. And we don't have to give anything up in our school systems or our tax systems or our companies or our hiring practices, because we're not rich, we're barely scraping by. But it's not true by comparison to everybody else. And we have to change who we're thinking about relatively. This is a quote from Richard Hofstadter, the famous historian who wrote about the Age of Reform, which was the era of the progressive era, which actually, and again, it was really a non-partisan move, and you think about Teddy Roosevelt and people like that, just to kind of move towards a sense of like a government that was committed to opportunity. And this is what he says preceded the progressive era, was the moral indignation of the age was by no means directed entirely against others. I suggest that right now, quite a lot of our moral indignation is directed entirely against others. The debate about inequality is always about somebody else. It's always somebody else's fault. It's the rich's fault, it's the immigrants' fault, it's poor people's fault, it's the top 1%'s fault, it's Wall Street's fault, it's business's fault, etc. It's never our fault, is it? How often do we look in the mirror and ask ourselves about our own implication in the systems? All of us have power in our institutions or our communities and so on, of varying degrees. And so actually, shouldn't just be directed entirely against others. It was in great and critical measure directed inward. Contemporaries who spoke of the movement as an affair of the conscience were not mistaken. My view is that in order to get the kinds of institutions and businesses and communities that we want, which are both prosperous, economically successful, and in a way that's inclusive, will require each of us to look inward as well as outward. And that will give us the sort of culture that we need to bring about the kind of changes that I think you all want to see. And with that, I'll stop with 5 minutes for questions. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? And I warn you, if there are no questions, I'm going to go back to some really boring charts. I saved the boring ones. This one's really boring. I'll leave that up there just to scare you. There's one here, there's one there. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really moving, actually. So, based on everything that you told us, since you teach at Georgetown University now, are you committing to maybe perhaps go teach at Northern Virginia Community College?
Well, this is being recorded, so I have to be a little bit careful what I say. You going to put all of this out? I've had a crisis of conscience about the fact that I teach at Georgetown. I write this book about how we're using our time, and then I have a bit of discretionary time and I use it to teach at Georgetown, where 25% of the students are from the top 1%. And although this is not how I would want Georgetown to discover this fact, I actually won't teach at Georgetown again, and I'm in conversations with a local community college about creating a Brookings course, where I get my colleagues to come along and do that. Well, yeah, but it's kind of you to applaud, but I should have thought of it 2 years ago. The truth is that what happens is, well, I'm at Brookings, where shall I teach? Oh, Georgetown. And oh yes, we'd love to have you teach. And you go, it's all great, use a British, it's all lovely. Look at our resumes. And so I just looked myself in the mirror and thought, what the hell are you doing? And so if I can actually, I do teach at UNLV, which is a 4-year college out in Vegas, a week a year, much more diverse student group, and I'm proud. There is a Brookings minor there, so I'm hoping that we'll be a local community, not Northern Virginia Community College, but a DC-based community college. I'm in discussions with them where I think I'll get my colleagues to come along and teach different modules, perhaps around sort of public policy and so on, because if we have extra time to spend, then it seems to me that we should be spending it not on the top 20%. So. Thank you for the question, and I'm sorry, Georgetown, if this is how you find out that I'm not teaching here anymore. That wasn't very good, was it? so they don't watch it. Okay, yes, here. There's one here. Any more? And there's one. Yeah, let's do that one, and then maybe this one, and then I'm probably. You scare me. Yes.
Right. Thank you, Richard. Very simple question. Which communities in this country are actually doing work that can have a meaningful impact on these issues?
It's a great question, and I think you may know my answer. I think we're still in the foothills of thinking about how communities act to promote upward mobility and opportunity. I think that actually, for too long, we tend to see this as a federal government issue, and there are obviously huge institutions, etc. But actually, as it turns out, income inequality is largely a federal and to some extent state government issue. Right? One thing those distant government institutions are good at is taking money from some people and giving it to other people, which in the end is really the only effective and quick way to change income inequality. But mobility, opportunity, is much less about money than it is about services, especially high-quality education, pre-K, pre-pre-K through home visiting, access to effective family health care, all of those things, school integration, neighborhood policy, workforce development, which you're going to hear about. All of those are quintessentially community issues and should be. So that's the setup. Somewhere like Charlotte, which we both know, came 50th out of 50 on one of Raj Chetty's rankings for upward mobility. And what's interesting about someone like Charlotte, and to some extent Baltimore, is that economically, on average, you take the median incomes, they're not bad. It's the distribution around the median that's the issue. So Charlotte is thriving, except it isn't for a lot of people in Charlotte. They're what I like to think of as like bypass cities or bypass communities, communities that on average are doing great, but those opportunities are bypassing whole subsections of that community. There are places in Charlotte where if you went to them and said how prosperous Charlotte was, they would think that you were poking fun at them, because it doesn't feel like that to them. So Charlotte has set up an opportunity task force and now has an implementation group. It's hopefully going to be partnering with Raj Chetty's group, who I've mentioned, in terms of getting really granular local data. But as I said, the reason I said we're in the foothills is because I think getting the kind of data that we just saw and then thinking how to use that is absolutely critical. So I would point to Charlotte, but there are other places too. I was just back from San Antonio, even some of the land use rows that are going on in California, and some of the school integration approaches that are taking place in California, I'm very much in favor of. So, but as I say, it's not. I don't want to get too far into that, other than to point to Charlotte, because it's the one that I know well, which is at least being serious about it. There's a seriousness of intent. This will take intentionality. This won't happen by itself. So a community has to intentionally act. And Charlotte is at least, I think, beginning to do that. Right, let's do one more and then I'm going to have to go because I've got the stop sign. And you all... Is it coffee now? We don't need coffee. Let's keep going.
Here's a question about unpaid internships and the rise in that. And so now you end up with kids who not only have that additional education, but they have that critical experience piece, and the only ones who can afford to do an unpaid internship are people who have the money and don't have to pay for their time for housing or anything else.
Yes, that's why I may skip this, but this is a survey of HR managers on what do they rank when they're deciding who to employ. A significant number of the people from four-year colleges, but increasingly two-year colleges, who have an internship, which helps them get a job. So internships have become a hugely important labour market institution, especially in some professions. They're a bridge to a job. And so I'm not against them in and of themselves, but at least half of them are unpaid. So there's that issue, which you said, which is how do you do it unless you've got family resources behind you? And then secondly, the way they're allocated isn't always very fair. So for the employers in the audience, if you do kind of have interns, really think hard about where you get them from and who you're serving by how you choose them. There are now a number of community colleges. I don't know if do you have internship programs now out of them? Yeah. So, and you're seeing really kind of strong relationship between some community colleges offering internships. There's a big policy debate about what you do about internships. My own view is that let's start from where we are and say, if you can't pay them, at least have some funds available for those who can't afford to pay for themselves. Aggressively recruit from non-traditional areas. Don't just do it. And don't do grace and favour internships. Don't do it as a favour to someone who you know is a friend and family, because although that seems like the right thing to do, it's the wrong thing to do. Because actually we're inadvertently just perpetuating class inequality and then wondering why we have charts like this and angry people out there. And so although it seems like, actually internships are quite symbolically important, I think. And when I talk to people who are outside the top 20% and so on, it's just almost unimaginable to them how one of their kids could go to DC or New York or Chicago or San Francisco and do an unpaid internship for three months. So how could they possibly do that? And so without necessarily anyone intending to, it becomes yet another mechanism in class inequality. And so Brookings has totally reformed our internship policy. We're trying to do it blind, and we're trying to do it based on we're going to pay people. But I think every organization, that's true of work experience. It's even true of something, and I will have to stop, something not about internships, but it's a small thing, which we've changed at Brookings now. There's a thing called Take Your Sons and Daughters to Work Day, which started off as Take Your Daughters to Work Day as a way to sort of try and get more women into professions, and then that was working quite well, so then they added Sons Pack, so now it's Take Your Daughters and Sons to Work Day. And the thing about that is, what it means is that if you have professional parents, you get to go and hang out in a professional workplace and learn that that's what work is like. If you have a working class parent, then what you do is you get to go and see what working class work is like, and if you don't have a parent in work, you don't get to go. And so without anyone intending it to, that apparently benign institution becomes yet another way that we transmit status across generations. So Brookings has abolished that, and we now take someone else's kid to work. And specifically what we do is we partner with two organizations in DC, one of which is predominantly working with low-income African-American kids, another one predominantly low-income Hispanic kids. And we take 150 kids out of DCPS schools for our career day. We don't take our own kids. We actually fill it up with other people's kids, most of whom don't have parents who either aren't working or are working in jobs where they wouldn't be allowed to take their kid to work, or it would just perpetuate this sense. So when you have an opportunity like that, work experience, internships, Take Your Kid to Work Day, intentionally think, how do I use this to open the door? They seem like small things, but I'm still mentoring one of the kids that came in last year. And so just bit by bit, we change the culture of institutions and maybe the culture of a society, and I think that's what will help create some of these opportunities. So opportunity is it's on charts, it's in indexes, it's in research papers, it's in policies, but it's also in ourselves. And I'll close with a quote from my favorite philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers, recent philosophers, Gerald Cohen, who wrote a book, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? Which was a great book with a great title. And in that he said, social justice isn't just found in our institutions and our laws, it is found in the way we treat each other in the thick of everyday life. In the thick of everyday life. And so actually that's, I think, part of our mantra too, is to combine a policy sensibility and institutional reform with how we are engaging with people in the thick of everyday life. That's inequality lives there as well as in all of these charts. And with that, thank you for your questions and your attention.